welcome back. We will start module 11, which is urban freight in this particular lecture, and this particular lecture will cover urban freight planning theory. So, the different concepts that will be covered in this particular lecture is the introduction to urban freight planning, then urban freight management, particularly the issues, then urban freight planning in general, and then urban freight survey techniques. So, basically we have already learned how to plan for passenger demand. So, in this particular module we will cover how to plan for freight in an urban area, and it has got many dimensions. But to start with, freight is basically the part of the city which is which keeps the city going. For example, using freight, we supply raw materials to the different industries, to the different markets, to the different retail stores and all, and at the same time we also distribute the finished good using freight. For example, something is produced in the city, we will distribute it using freight as well. So, basically freight is the main link in between supply and demand. So, without freight we cannot have supply satisfying demand, or and also demand and demand actually generates also supply, because if there is no demand there is also no point of supplying there. So, it is a link which is maintained by freight, and that is why freight is very important when we plan for our urban areas. So, freight sustains urban supply chains and determines the overall mobility of the city, because we understand that movement of freight vehicles also happens parallelly along with the normal passenger vehicles. So, the overall mobility of the city is dependent on to some extent on the freight vehicle movement as well. And because freight is the primary lifeline that actually connects the different retails or the industries or the markets with the with the actual manufacturers and all. So, in that case we actually have to really think about how to improve on the the efficiency of the freight movement within a city urban area. So, in order to make cities competitive, the cost of not only passenger but also freight transport has to be reduced drastically. So, that means we have discussed earlier that if we make our cities more compact, then probably the transportation cost will reduce, because people will have to travel for lesser distances. The same also goes for freight as well. So, if we organize our freight planning, or if we do our freight planning efficiently, we will also result in lower transport cost, and that will also help in improving the competitiveness of the city. So, but as you know that in most cases the main focus of urban planners or urban policymakers is passenger transport, but freight is usually ignored, but big freight is one of the major contributors to the economy of the city. So, we cannot ignore that, and we really need, time has come to integrate freight planning very as a part of the overall 4-stage transportation or the travel demand modeling process. So, freight is while freight has got a lot of positive benefits, but it has got some negative externalities as well. For example, like congestion, it is one of the primary causes of congestion, because freight vehicles are of different sizes, they are not that maneuverable. There has to be loading unloading done when there is a freight involved. That means when you are supplying somewhere, it not only the vehicle that comes in, but also you have to load and unload from it. So, all these things leads to congestion, and freight vehicles are slower compared to other vehicles. That also leads to certain amount of congestion as well. Then there are certain accidents that happen with freight vehicle because of their size, as well as difficult to maneuver them and all. So, it may lead to accidents, and sometimes it is also because of overloading and lot of other issues which needs to be also regulated. So, and also freight vehicles are more polluting compared to normal passenger vehicles. So, these are the different negative or the externalities that has to be also looked into. So, now traditional freight, how it has been till now, it's basically there are manufacturers which actually supplies the city either directly or through they first supply to a warehouse and a distribution center, you can say, and then from there using smaller vehicles the goods are being transported inside the city. Now, the second part is basically the last mile delivery part. That means from the distribution center to the end customer. So, this last part of the distribution is called last mile logistics, we can call it sometimes. And so, the overall process actually during the last few years, it has gone a major overhaul. So now with the advent of e-commerce and home delivery, it's changing the nature of freight flows drastically. Why? Because till now the distribution was like first it comes to a distribution center. From there it goes to the major wholesale markets or also to some big retail outlets, and from wholesale markets it again goes to the retail outlets, and people used to go to retail outlets to buy their goods. Whereas now, because of this B2C e-commerce, like business to customer directly, so people are getting their orders directly at their home, and so sellers have to fulfill single orders over large geographical distances, and that is changing the nature of freight. So that is what we should also focus, because that is also leading to a lot of travel kilometers for freight vehicles. So, two of the primary objectives of freight planning are to lower the transport and freight costs to increase competitiveness of our cities. This is the major thing that we have to consider, but at the same time negative externalities like pollution and congestion also has to be reduced as well. So, freight flows are influenced by many factors. For example, the location of the industry, the type of the industry, what kind of supply chain the industry have got, this actually influences the freight flow. For example, there is a bottling plant for soft drinks. So usually what they do is they load a vehicle, and the vehicle goes from retail outlet to outlet, dropping a part of the consignment, and it is how it replenishes the goods in each of those particular retail stores. So this is one form of supply chain. Then there could be a supply chain where the goods from industry first go to a wholesale market, or then it is then it goes to the different retail outlets from where customers can get those, or it can go to a sort of a distribution center from where another set of trucks can actually take it to different markets or retail centers and so on. So there could be different forms of supply chain, and the location of industry, what kind of industry it is, it has got a big role to play on deciding what kind of freight flows it will generate. So, transport infrastructure is the second part. Of course, we can understand if the there is a lag in transport infrastructure, definitely freight flow, all kinds of vehicle flows will suffer. But because for freight, the better the infrastructure, better is the flow of freight. So freight actually suffers much more than normal passenger transport. So then comes the infrastructure for logistics. That means this is a little bit tricky. Why? Because in our country or in developing countries, we see that most of the freight is done through informal carriers. That means there is no, that means a particular company, when it wants to deliver something, it will use its own vehicles or it will hire somebody directly. So there is very little third party logistics provider. That means companies which offer their services either to a particular company or to anybody in the market, so that the companies who actually is sending a consignment, they will not be bothered about with whose other consignments my consignment will go. So this kind of consolidation of consignments from different companies is done by these third party logistics providers, and then they can attain efficiency by consolidating this kind of consignments from not one provider but from multiple providers. Similarly, once after delivery, instead of making an empty trip, a third party logistic provider would probably try to manage getting another consignment load from that particular point, so that the return trip is also utilized. That means it's a profitable return trip. So this kind of infrastructure for logistic also needs to be there in the city to make the total supply chain more competitive as well. So then type of goods vehicle used, or definitely what kind of goods vehicle are used, that do play a role. And then this access and loading regulations are very, very city specific. Certain cities have got certain kinds of regulations, some related with time, some related with size of vehicles, some related with certain kinds of streets are allowed to be free for loading unloading at a certain time of the day. Other streets there is no allowance for that as well. So all these things play a role. and existing traffic conditions of the city, that means what is the current congestion levels and all, that also plays a big role. And finally, behavior of customers, that is use of e-commerce. Sorry. So, use of e-commerce, this actually plays also another big role, like certain socio-demographic groups are more, certain cities you will see that there is lot of e-commerce activity, in other cities there is not. It depends on the culture of the people, it depends on the economic background of the people and so on. So, this all plays a role in determining what kind of freight flows would be generated in a particular urban area. So, another major point is most of the freight activities take place close to major transport terminals, and that means this could be a port, this could be a highway, and it could be a intermodal center, or it could be a logistics hub. So, these are mostly located just outside the city. So, these are not within city limits. So, so the main freight activity, that is the bigger carriers and all, they mostly don't enter the urban area. They may touch the urban area and then go away. So, they just come to the external this particular locations where these transshipments happen, and then they move on. Whereas smaller vehicles or smaller trucks could be used for even transporting goods within the urban area. So, when we are planning for these freight activities, we should be able to define the zone that for which we are doing our plan. So, otherwise if we do not consider this kind of activities, then probably we will miss the big picture. So, we need to be aware of all the different surrounding freight activities of an urban area as well. So, as we were discussing, urban supply chain service different economic sectors and subsectors. Like for example, there are separate supply chains for grocery stores, there are separate supply chains for retail, restaurants, raw materials for industry, real estate, and even waste management. So, the supply chain for waste management is different from the supply chain from real estate. So, each industry and how movement happens has to be investigated. So, for example, in this particular image you can see that there are trips which are made from external to external, and then there are trips which are made from external to internal. So, internal basically means internal to the city. So, from outside the city, that means maybe from another city or from another district or from another state, vehicles come and they can come to industries located within the city, warehouses within the city, freight terminals within the city, or directly to retail stores within the city. And similarly, from industry within the city, it could go even to warehouses, from where it can go to external, maybe outside, it would be exported out, or it could go to another warehouse or freight terminals, or it could directly be going to the retail stores inside the city. So, this kind of different form of connections are possible. So, so there are some and then there are certain, so these trips particularly like this one, in industry to retail, these are internal trips. That is internal to internal. Even industry to warehouse, this is an internal trip. Whereas from warehouse to external, these are external trips, and these are also external trips. So, we need to understand that what kind of flows are there that are happening in our urban area. So, goods transport accounts for about based on this report from UN Habitat in 2013, around 10 to 15% of vehicle equivalent kilometers are for urban goods transport. So, this is purely goods transport that happens within the urban area internally. So, this is 10 to 15% of all kinds of movement that happens. Then 2 to 5% of the workforce is engaged in this particular sector, and 3 to 5% of urban land use is also dedicated for this loading, unloading, and similar activities like warehousing and also this kind of activities. So, a city both receives and ships goods. So, it will not only like it is receiving goods as well as it is shipping away goods. So, around 20 to 25% of the truck kilometers are outgoing freight. That means it goes away from the city. 40 to 50% are incoming freight. That means there are goods which satisfies different industries in the city, or different warehouses, or different requirements of the city to produce more goods, and certain goods are for consumption. So, that is why we see the maximum percentage of trips are incoming freight. So around 50% is incoming. So if I have 50% and 25%, so the rest 25% both start and end within the city. So that means we can say the rest 25% of trips both are, or maybe if we talk in terms of goods, are starts inside the, produced inside the city as well as consumed inside the city. So we can talk both in terms of trips or in terms of commodities. We will see that in the next lecture. So we can define goods movement in a city in terms of number of truckloads, or it could be also in number or in the amount of goods that move from one sector to another sector. So that is why we can say that a certain amount is consumed within the city and certain amount is exported out of the city as well. So in this particular image, you can see that, again, this image is from the same report where the authors are identifying three primary components of this urban freight planning process. So one is operations, the other is the different modes used for freight, and finally the infrastructure. And within modes, we have got the biggest contributor are the trucks, and there are few alternative modes, right? So the trucks are the primary vehicles used for delivering goods in an urban area. And then within operations, there is scheduling operations, the times, the routing operations, which routes we are allowing vehicles, parking operations, and then loading unloading operations. So if you see, the parking and loading unloading are the biggest circles. So accordingly, that is the impact of this kind of operations. For example, this parking operation is of biggest challenge, and next comes the loading unloading operation. So we should focus on to decide on which are the parking locations in the city, when we will allow parking and so on. So this is one big challenge. We should make sure that there is adequate space for trucks to park whenever they comes to deliver and all. So this is really a big challenge faced by all urban areas. We see that during night time in most of the cities at around 9 when goods traffic is being allowed into the cities, there are huge traffic congestion. Or not only that, we see that the trucks lined up at the side of the streets, and it creates problems in flows for other vehicles. So there has to be proper provision for making keeping space for truck parking. And then comes the space for loading unloading. That means we can have a retail street, but if there is no space designated that okay, this is a place where a vehicle will stand, or a truck will stand, and then this is the space, additional space required for loading unloading. Because if you need to do loading unloading, there has to be certain clearances at the side, certain clearances at the back of the truck, depends on how you are parking the truck, of course. But this kind of spaces are required, which has to be considered when we plan for our urban areas or plan for our retail streets. So these are the biggest challenges when we think about operations, freight operations in the city. And finally, when we are talking about infrastructure, of course, the biggest challenge is roads. We should have wide roads in the city, which is understood, but this is common for both passenger vehicles as well as freight vehicles. Whereas for terminals and distribution centers, these are the second order infrastructures that are required to support freight operations. So we should be also planning for location of terminals, location of distribution centers, and so on. So terminals are primarily for trucks. It's a truck terminal where trucks wait, where trucks are from where they could be distributed to different areas, and distribution centers are where primarily it's about goods. So goods, it's a good storage from where it gets distributed. So city logistics are of many forms and depends on supply chain and urban characteristics that we have discussed. So there are consumer related distribution, then there are producer related distribution, and then there are trucks, of course, which actually are used for distribution. So producer related distribution means it is related with the companies themselves, like the construction sites, waste collection and disposal. So there is no final end customer involved, or industrial and terminal freight movement. So like goods coming to our industry, then going out of the industries. So these are managed by maybe one set of authorities, whereas the consumer related distribution is managed by another set of authorities. It is managed using another set of guidelines. So there are a lot of like for example, when you move raw materials from one location to another city, there has to be record of it. There are way bills, there records of certain amount of taxes that has to be given for that. Then there is certain kinds of deliveries like food deliveries in the city or parcel and home deliveries. Then there is retailing, and then there is chain retailing. So that this kind of supply chains are consumer focused. So this has to operate using a different set of rules. But in any case, trucks are used in both the cases, and it's a dominant mode of supporting city logistics. But as you know, trucks, because of unplanned, we don't have adequate plans for freight movement in an urban area. Trucks faces the maximum constraints. So as you understand that if we make our trucks to face this constraint, automatically the supply chain will falter. So there we actually will lose money. So that is why we should make sure that the movement of trucks should be very, very efficient in a city, and we need to plan for that. So next, coming to urban freight management, freight being the main challenge of this freight in planning in urban areas is it is mostly a private, it's a service. That means it is provided by private operators. There are no big agencies or government operators operating this kind of service. And there are multiple stakeholders, of course. There are, for example, policy makers are there. Then there are we will discuss about different groups which are actually have a stake in this freight planning in an urban area. But basically what happens, because policymakers have to make policies for the entire city to make it more efficient and to make all the tasks coordinated. So they have to face a challenge because all the stakeholders are private. So this is one big problem that we have to face in the city, because private entities usually are not, they don't want to share the data because that would reveal their business secrets to some extent. So private carriage, there are two kinds of basic operation. We were discussing this a little bit earlier. Like there is private carriage, that is freight which is organized by the cargo owners. That means from manufacturers, freight is going to the retailers, and there usually these companies have their own employees and own fleet, or they subcontract to an independent carrier with its own vehicles. But the subcontract is not a one-off contract. It could be a one-off contract, but usually there are long-term contracts as well. That means somebody else is going to give trucks for your movement, and that has been that would be there for 1 year or 2 years or a certain amount of consignment, or there could be many kinds of negotiation between these two parties. But at the same time, this actually basically means that the trucks depend on the particular entity for which it is working. So again, there may be loss of efficiency. That means the trucks will go to deliver but will come back empty, or maybe they will come back with something, but it may not be a full truckload. So the efficiency factor of utilization of truck which will actually be low. So whereas there are common carriers where these are third party logistics providers, we will say that. So they service any customers on a contractual basis and benefits from consolidation of cargoes and deliveries. So this is not a one-to-one relationship, this is one-to-many relationship sort of, where this contractor actually is providing a service to multiple this kind of cargo owners. So usually we find in developed countries the share of private and common carriers is around 50-50. Whereas in developing countries there is almost non-existent these common carriers. Most of these carriers are private carriers. That means there may be subcontracted, there are separate agencies which provide trucks, but there is a one-to-one contract between these parties. So usually this is the structure of normal, non-developed markets. We see this kind of structure in the supply chains in the non-developed markets, as well as there is also a lot of involvement of the informal sector. That means lot of smaller vans, or not even non-motorized vans. This kind of vehicles are also used for delivery. So this informal sector plays a very big role, and that is also has to be considered when we plan for freight in an urban area in a developing country. So because of informal carriers, there is lot of challenge in data collection, because in India you can understand it is almost impossible to get data from these informal carriers other than doing some surveys at the roadside surveys. And then certain interventions like a regulation, we say that you cannot do loading unloading at this point of time, or you can not go into this kind of state. This actually creates a good effect in the society, because that will reduce the travel time for everybody else. But at the same time, these private entities, there are both informal and formal, they will bear the brunt of this regulation. So they will lose a lot of money, and because they are already not making money by consolidation and so on. So that actually reduces their profit margins. So this is one big challenge. And that is why any kind of policies in this terms are vehemently protested by business owners and shippers in an developing countries, urban areas. So there is absence of also traffic management strategies for freight, and there is also very little alternative modes of freight transport, like waterways could be also a good form of freight transport. So this kind of segments could also be developed in a developing country. So when we talk about urban freight management, there are different issues that we have to be aware of. The first group of issues we have discussed. So we also have, I was talking about stakeholders earlier. So stakeholders need to form groups in an urban area to actually put their concerns or put their wish list in front of the policymakers, so that there could be proper negotiation and among the so that ultimately a good plan comes out. So for that we have something called freight quality partnerships in many urban areas. We have freight advisory boards and forums in urban areas, and also we can cities sometimes designate a city logistic manager who actually plan or help in coordinating all this regulations and all the different freight activities in an urban area. So some of the regulatory measures that is undertaken in urban areas, there is time access restriction, only certain times to enter or exit the city. There are parking regulations, there are environmental regulations, there is size load access regulations like the vehicle size and all. Then there are freight flow traffic flow management regulations. Then there are market based measures like urban congestion charges, travel distance based taxes, tradable permits, which are also charged from the shippers or the trucks or the vehicles that enter into the urban area. So this kind of market based measures are also there. Then that means our planners and urban policymakers has to design this kind of regulations which could be actually efficient for the overall city. So then along with that, planners are also responsible for land use planning and infrastructure measures. So basically adopting of on-street zones for loading unloading, and then using building code regulations for off-street delivery areas, nearby delivery areas, like it's not near just on the in front of your building or front of your shop. It could be a little bit far away, but it's still nearby delivery area. Then upgrading central off-street loading areas, integrating logistic plans into the land use planning and urban consolidation centers. So these are the different things that has to be planned or thought of when we're doing a land use planning, because these are actually in our Indian conditions, we really don't think about this kind of aspects when we plan for our urban areas. We actually leave them out, or rather it skips our thought process, because freight is never considered as one of the major contributors to the efficiency of mobility or improving mobility in an urban area, or also which contributes to the economy of that urban area. So this kind of measures has to be integrated into the land use planning process as well. So when we in the next lecture, we will be talking about freight modeling. That means similar to the travel demand management, how do we demand freight and all. So there we also need to be concerned about different policies and different effect of those policies and so on. So certain this kind of effects could be based on use of electric vehicles or dynamic routing. That means if we can, like in dynamic assignment, we can also do dynamic routing of vehicles, real-time traffic information system for freight, then crowdsourced deliveries, then bicycle deliveries. So these are the new things that could be also explored in an urban area. And already we see bicycle deliveries by some of the food delivery companies adopting bicycle to deliver goods, right? So then, in addition to this, we also need to raise the awareness level in the city for drivers, particularly like anti-idling behavior. Then drivers should drive in the eco modes, and then overall, from the city's perspective, we should shift towards water, rail, cycle, walk. These are the more sustainable modes, and staggered work hours, recognition and certification programs for people who are doing good work. So this actually improves the freight management in an urban area. So, in addition to all this, we also need to improve efficiency of freight transport without compromising the quality of urban life. So, that means it doesn't mean that we will reduce our choices, our options in urban area, but just to improve freight transport. So, both has to go hand in hand. So, it has to be an integrated regulatory, promotional, financial, technical and infrastructure measures. So, we cannot just take one policy which is not adhering to only one thing and the other things are ignored. So, it should be an integrated policy, and there has to be cooperation across different layers of government and private actors, because most of the freight operators are private actors or the stakeholders are private actors. Like we have to also stick to the legal framework for enabling regulations, because we cannot just make a rule for which there is no basis for. And then we also have to gain political support and institutional ownership. Like if something bad happens, there has to be somebody responsible. So ownership has to be there, or if somebody is doing something, some responsibilities has to be assigned. So this ownership is very important, plus political support is required. And as we are discussing, there are multiple stakeholder partnerships are there between private, public, academic, industrial experts, and of course citizen involvement to come out with a good freight management plan for an urban area. So, who are the stakeholders? Stakeholders are supply chain managers, transporters, manufacturers, wholesalers, retail chain owners, shopkeeper associations, vendor association, transport workers association, industry and commerce association, and consumer associations. So, similar to making a land use transportation plan, or a transportation plan or a mobility plan, if I want to make a urban freight plan, in that case we have to bring in all these stakeholders, take their feedback, and also need to understand what kind of demands they generate, what kind of commodities they work with, what kind of number of trips are originating from their particular business. So all these things play a role, and that actually will help us to plan for freight management. So we also need to be aware of the boundary of a planning boundary, because many of the things happen outside the boundary. So geographic scope has to be carefully decided along with linkages with other plans like regional plans for that particular area. So these are some of the data that we need to gather. Like we need to have a comprehensive data collection framework which includes major and minor freight generators. And as I was talking about, there is a huge amount of challenge in getting data from private operators, but ULBs, like urban bodies, are the licensing authorities, so they can make certain rules which makes sharing of data to some extent obligatory. So if that is done, then we can actually do the planning in a more efficient manner. So then comes urban freight traffic data. So it's not only the total freight data in terms of quantities of goods that travel from one point to another, but also the freight traffic data. That means along which routes freight flow, means what is the traffic counts in different roads at different times of the day, and so on. So from this we can identify the traffic flow patterns, both intracity, intercity and regional flows, which we have discussed earlier. Then identify urban characteristics and freight influencing factors. Why is freight, the next question, like in trip generation, why a certain zone produces more trips than another, or why a certain zone attracts more trips than another. So we did regression models to understand the different underlying factors or explanatory variables which actually determines the total number of trips generated. Same way, we also need to understand the different urban characteristics like economy, demographics, consumer requirements, logistic solutions adopted, prevalent novel technologies, ecology, and also the different other freight influencing factors like, for example, over here, quantity of deliveries, number of time of deliveries from each zone or from each industry in each zone or for each sector in each zone, then vehicle type, journey length, journey speed, deadheading, Deadheading is when you are going to one point and then you are returning with an empty vehicle, and you are returning the vehicle, you are not waiting there, just to make sure that there is enough vehicle supply on the other end from where lot of deliveries are happening. So this is deadheading. Then type of loading and unloading activities, location and type of industries and warehouses, existing transport infrastructure, access and loading regulations, share of e-commerce in retail. All these different things influence the total amount of freight that is both generated and attracted in different zones in an urban area, or different industries in an urban area, right? So these are the different data that we require when we want to develop a plan for an urban area, which is almost similar to developing a plan for passenger mobility as well. So urban freight planning, we need to predict the demand and supply trend by different stakeholders. We use regression models for that. We need to identify the different disruptive technologies that may take place within a few years. Then we have to have freight demand model. Then we need to develop our freight demand model. So it's primarily it's a 4-stage model, like we have developed for passenger traffic as well. And then levels and types of interventions as per targets, such as reducing emissions, congestion, freight loading and unloading time. So these are the different policies my model would be able to give result for. That means I can change certain targets and I will change certain parameters to see what, and my model will be able to predict what is the effect in change in emission or congestion or freight loading and unloading times. So this will actually help us to improve our different plans or improve the different policies that we actually propose for an urban area. So scenarios are also built for different time horizons, and because we have got short term impact, things which have a short term impact, long term impact and medium term impacts, and it is the scenarios are not just randomly developed by urban planners. It has to be developed based on stakeholder consultation, because they may intervene, they have their own difficulties and obstacles and potential conflict of interest, which has to be resolved before we actually decide on certain targets for a particular urban area. So the plans comes along with like a normal development plan exercise. We also have got financial analysis and budgeting for the plans to implement those kind of measures, then budget monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, and finally timeline for different projects and phasing. I will quickly just take you through the different freight survey techniques that we undertake. We do establishment surveys. It's a method to collect data about quantity and type of goods and number of vehicle trips to and from establishment like shops, warehouses, etc., and their temporal variation. So this is establishment survey. Commodity survey is more or less same, but it's where we also gather what kind of goods and quantity of goods, and we are not that much concerned about the vehicle trip. So we determine the total tonnage that goes from one part to another, or one zone to another, or from one industry to another, or one entity to another, like shops to warehouses and so on. So this commodity flow survey and establishment survey are more or less same. In one we focus on the vehicle trips and their variation. In another we also determine the total commodities that are exchanged. So driver and supplier and service provider surveys. So here we interview drivers to gather information on trip patterns, loading, unloading activities, how much time it takes to load, unload for a particular type of good, and when do they undertake those trips. So this kind of information we gather from them. Suppliers share know-how of goods dispatched and corresponding vehicle flows. That means how they organize, suppliers when they send a particular goods to another distribution center or to retailers, how they organize their goods, what kind of dispatch or dispatch loads. That means how many trucks at one point of time, how they load the trucks. All this information actually comes into play. Then service providers share data about entire delivery fleet compared to a single vehicle. So that is understood. So then vehicle traffic count survey, we also do traffic surveys. Surveyors collect number and type of vehicles crossing specified cordons by time of the day and day of the week, and it could be carried on a single route or across entire cities. So depends on what kind of extent that we are doing the survey for. We can plan for a certain corridor, we can plan for the entire traffic plan, freight traffic plan for the entire city. Accordingly, we will decide what kind of service we will undertake. We also have vehicle trip diaries. So this is particularly when we do interview of the drivers, or maybe even we do interview in the establishments. We can do vehicle trip diaries, and it's similar to travel diaries. We collect information on all trips carried out during a certain past period. It could be a day, it could be a week, because certain times truck tours are not like trips. It's like a tour, like it goes from one place to another, then from there to another point, and then it again returns back. So we have to collect data over a week, and for different types of vehicles we would do that. So what kind of data points? Exact location served, route undertaken, arrival and departure time, time taken for deliveries, collection, servicing, type of goods and service, alternative routes. All this information is collected, which is almost similar to a passenger equivalent to almost like a passenger travel diary. We also do parking service, information about vehicle loading, unloading and parking activity at different stretches of road, and method of moving goods from vehicles such as vehicle type, time taken, illegal, any kind of illegal activities also, and rather than total delivery, collection trips at establishment. So this is where parking service comes in. And finally, we have survey of logistic infrastructure, like what kind of logistic infrastructure like terminals, warehouses, loading, unloading areas are there, how many trucks come there, how much time they stay there, then where they go, which are the areas from where they come from. All this information is collected from the survey of logistic infrastructure. So these are some of the references you can study. And to conclude, urban planners and policymakers are gradually realizing the importance of urban freight planning in urban development. Then economic development of an urban area is intrinsically linked with supply and delivery of goods and materials originating and terminating from it. So there is a need to plan for optimizing freight transport movement in an urban area, both to reduce cost and to improve negative externalities like pollution and congestion. And one major challenge for urban freight transport planning is data availability, since most of the data is in the hands of private operators who are reluctant to share their business data.